The first time I met her, I believe, was at the Do You Want to Do My Special meeting. And that's usually, it was Karen and her brother, Richard, and everybody's people. We all had people.
Richard Carpenter is 78 years old. He has spent 4 decades carefully choosing his words about his sister. But something shifted in his final years, and the careful words gave way to honest ones. He said every day that passes upsets him more than the day before. He said she was silenced way too soon. He said a voice like hers appears once in 3 generations. What he did not say for decades is what this story is actually about. What Richard Carpenter finally confirms. For decades after Karen's death, Richard Carpenter gave interviews that circled the full truth without quite landing on it. He talked about the music, the era, and the absence of public understanding about eating disorders in the 1970s. All of those things were true, but they were not the complete truth. And the distance between what he said and what he understood grew heavier with every year that passed. What he is confirming now, without the protective softening of earlier decades, is this. The pressure placed on Karen's appearance, the demand to maintain a flawless public image across years of exhausting touring, the scrutiny of her body as a professional variable rather than a human reality, all contributed directly to what happened to her. Her illness was not the product of personal weakness or a single traumatic incident. It was the convergence of a family structure that made her feel secondary since childhood, an industry that removed her one safe space and replaced it with relentless exposure, and a cultural era that had no framework for recognizing what was happening until far too late. He is also confirming something that cuts even deeper. He is confirming that Karen never truly believed she was the exceptional one. The rumors that circulated for years about her bewilderment when legendary artists called her extraordinary, her complete failure to understand what her voice meant to the world, all of that was entirely real. Paul McCartney called her the best female voice in the world. Elton John called her one of the greatest voices of his lifetime. Herb Alpert said a voice like hers appears once in a generation. John Lennon told her backstage that she had a lovely voice. And Karen was, in Richard's own precise words, flabbergasted. Barbra Streisand praised her directly, and Karen did not know what to do with the compliment. Richard told her more than once that, of course, all of these people were going to say she was great because she genuinely was great. She did not believe him. She believed she was a drummer who had been moved to the front of the stage for commercial reasons and whose voice happened to be useful to the enterprise. The internal story she told herself had been written in that house on Hall Street before she was old enough to choose a different one. Now consider what Richard is confirming about the solo album Karen recorded with Phil Ramone in 1979. She walked into a New York studio and made the most adventurous record of her life, entirely outside the framework Richard had always built around her. During those sessions, she turned down 2 songs by Rod Temperton, Off the Wall, and Rock With You, which Michael Jackson subsequently recorded and turned into 2 of the biggest hits of his career. The album incorporated disco, rhythm and blues, jazz, and contemporary pop. It cost $500,000 to produce, and it sounded nothing like anything the Carpenters had ever released. It was Karen showing the world exactly who she was, without anyone else's architecture surrounding her. The album was played for A&M executives and met with silence. Herb Alpert reportedly called it unreleasable. Richard expressed reservations. Agnes discouraged Karen from working outside the duo structure. Phil Ramone later called the decision not to release it one of the greatest disappointments of his professional career. The album was shelved for 17 years before being released posthumously in 1996, and when people finally heard it, they understood immediately that they were listening to an artist who had been capable of considerably more than the people surrounding her had allowed her to demonstrate. Randy Schmidt concluded after years of research that if the people around Karen had stood behind that album in 1980, she would have received the confidence she needed at exactly the moment she needed it most. That with that confidence, she would not have rushed into the devastating marriage with Burris. That without that marriage and the collapse it produced, the final acceleration of her illness might not have happened the way it did. The official cause of death was emetine cardiotoxicity caused by anorexia nervosa. Emetine is the active compound in ipecac syrup, an over-the-counter emetic that destroys heart muscle with sustained use. Levenkron said afterwards that Karen almost certainly believed she was taking something harmless. She did not understand she had been slowly stopping her own heart. Ipecac syrup was banned from over-the-counter sale in 2003, 20 years too late for Karen. Her death produced the public conversation her life was never allowed to have. Before February 4th of 1983, the phrase anorexia nervosa had no cultural face and no widely recognized meaning in everyday life. After it, the conversation became impossible to avoid. Research was funded. Treatment frameworks were built. The substance that destroyed her heart was removed from store shelves. Her death reached forward in time and saved people she never had the chance to meet. Richard is 78 years old. He gives interviews where he says a voice like hers appears once in 3 generations. He said on the Grammy website in December of 2024 that every day upsets him more than the one before it. That is not grief softening with age. That is grief deepening as understanding grows. The more clearly he sees what actually happened, the heavier the weight of carrying it becomes. Karen Carpenter sold more than 100 million records worldwide. Rolling Stone named her one of the 100 greatest singers of all time. Paul McCartney called her voice the best female voice in the world, and she spent her entire career not quite believing any of it, because the people who were supposed to make her believe it either could not find the words or did not understand until far too late that the words were the only medicine that was ever going to work. To fully get the essence of what Richard Carpenter said about his sister, you need to understand the house she grew up in, because everything he is now confirming began there, long before anyone knew there was anything to confirm. The house where only one child counted. Richard Carpenter posted on Instagram on March 2nd of 2026. It was what would have been Karen's 76th birthday. He called her voice perfect, truly perfect, and said there would never be another like it. But if you have been paying attention to what Richard has been saying publicly over the past several years, those few words carry an enormous amount of weight that has nothing to do with a routine birthday tribute. In a Grammy.com interview from December of 2024, Richard said something he had been building toward for a very long time. He said every single day that passes upsets him more than the one before it. He said he keeps thinking of all the years they could have spent making new music together. And then he said the sentence that reframes everything before it. He said he would love to have told her one more time just how genuinely great a singer she actually was. One more time. Those 3 words carry an enormous amount of weight. They tell you he did not say it enough when it counted. They tell you he knows that. And they tell you he has been living with that knowledge for over 4 decades. What Richard is slowly and deliberately confirming is this. The rumors about Karen Carpenter were not rumors. They were the truth. The truth about a household that organized itself entirely around one child and treated the other as adjustable. The truth about an industry that stripped away the one space where she ever felt genuinely safe and handed her a spotlight in its place. The truth about an illness that everyone around her could see and nobody had the tools to stop. And the truth about what it does to a person when the people who are supposed to love them most are never quite able to say so in the way that person most needs to hear it. Agnes Carpenter had decided very early that Richard was the exceptional one. He had shown genuine musical ability almost from infancy, studied at the Yale School of Music by age 14, and had neighbors convinced he was going somewhere before he turned 12. Agnes organized the family's emotional and financial resources around that trajectory without apology. Biographer Randy Schmidt described Agnes plainly as a woman who dealt in control in just about every possible way. What that control looked like for Karen was specific and consistent. If Richard was upset, Karen was blamed. If Karen succeeded in ways that positioned her ahead of her brother, even in something as minor as being chosen first for a neighborhood baseball team, Agnes corrected it rather than celebrated it. Schmidt discovered through multiple interviews that Agnes consistently told Karen she was just lucky to be along for the ride, that without Richard, she was nothing, that she should never mistake herself for the important one. These are not small things to say to a child. They produce no visible wounds and leave no obvious evidence. They settle into a person and silently reshape every assumption that person makes about whether they deserve the space they occupy. Harold Carpenter loved his children genuinely, but was content to let Agnes run the household without challenge. His love for Karen was real. His protection was not sufficient. And in the house Karen grew up inside, those two things were simply not the same. Karen absorbed all of this without visible complaint. She was funny and warm and genuinely athletic, a serious baseball fan who was consistently chosen first by the neighborhood kids. But underneath that likable personality, she was absorbing a lesson no child should ever be required to internalize. Her needs came second. Approval from the people who mattered most was conditional. Love in this household had to be earned rather than received. Richard is confirming now that she carried that lesson into every room she walked into for the rest of her life. Upbringing of the legend. In June of 1963, the Carpenter family moved from New Haven, Connecticut, to a suburb of Los Angeles called Downey. Karen was 13 years old. She left behind every friend she had, every familiar routine, and whatever fragile sense of stability a child builds out of known places. Nobody asked her whether she wanted to go. The official reason for the move was that Harold had received a job offer in California and had long wanted to escape the Connecticut winters. Both of those things were true. But the real force behind the relocation was Agnes, and Agnes had one fixed target in mind. California meant proximity to the music industry, to studios and professional musicians, and the kind of career infrastructure a prodigy in New Haven could never fully access. It meant Richard's future could stop being theoretical and start being real. Karen's feelings about any of this were simply not part of the calculation. The family settled in Downey, a working-class suburb 13 miles southeast of downtown Los Angeles. For a 13-year-old girl who had just lost every friend she had, it was a place with no history and no comfort. Karen entered Downey High School a full year younger than most of her classmates. She tried the flute and hated it. She tried the accordion and hated that too. She joined the school choir to avoid a geometry class and the marching band to avoid gym class. Music at this point in her life was still a workaround, not yet a place where she felt she truly belonged. Richard graduated from Downey High School just 1 year after arriving and enrolled immediately at California State College at Long Beach. He was already performing as a lounge act and playing organ at the local Methodist church. He had direction and an audience wherever he walked. Karen watched a new city pass outside her window and looked for somewhere that genuinely felt like hers. What the move confirmed to Karen, without anyone needing to state it directly, was something the household had already been demonstrating for years. Her feelings were not the governing consideration. Her life was adjustable. She existed somewhere in the periphery of the family's central mission, present and included, but never quite central. She would spend the rest of her life looking for a space that truly belonged to her. She found it inside a high school band room. And what she found there should have permanently changed every assumption the people around her had made about which Carpenter child was genuinely exceptional. Behind the kit, the band conductor at Downey High School handed Karen a glockenspiel, and she hated it almost immediately. Then she looked across the room, saw a classmate named Frankie Chavez sitting behind a full drum kit, and understood in an instant that whatever that was, it was exactly what she needed. Frankie Chavez was not an ordinary student musician. He had started playing drums at 2 years old and was performing professionally alongside Lionel Hampton by the age of 11. When Karen watched him play, she was watching someone who had turned rhythm into a private world. And she recognized immediately that she needed to live in that world too. Her parents purchased a Ludwig drum kit for $300, which was not a modest expense for a family already making payments on Richard's piano. Karen enrolled with a jazz instructor named Bill Douglas, who had performed alongside Benny Goodman and Art Tatum. She practiced until her fingers split open and bled. Richard recalled that their mother kept bandages close at hand because the damage was constant, and Karen refused to stop. Within a single year, she was executing complex jazz rhythms that most adult beginners never attempt. Richard said watching her play looked as though she had been born inside a drum factory. Here is what Richard is now confirming about this period that makes it genuinely important. He has said plainly and on the record that he truly believes Karen always considered herself a drummer, who sang rather than a singer who happened to play drums. That distinction was not a preference or a personality detail. It was the foundation of her identity as a musician. Behind the drums, for the first time in her life, she had found a place where that identity could exist without needing anyone's approval or permission. She was not secondary to anyone behind that kit. She had chosen it entirely herself and built it from the ground up with her own effort and her own bleeding fingers. In June of 1966, the Richard Carpenter Trio performed at the Hollywood Bowl Battle of the Bands. Karen was 16 years old. They won 3 trophies, including the overall sweepstakes prize, and received a favorable notice from respected Los Angeles Times jazz critic Leonard Feather. The win produced a recording contract with RCA Records, which then shelved all 11 recorded tracks, decided there was no commercial future in the group's unconventional sound, and quietly ended the relationship. Karen had just won one of the most prestigious amateur competitions in the country and received a formal rejection as her primary reward. Buddy Rich, the most technically demanding drummer of his generation, told people backstage that Karen Carpenter was one of his favorite drummers. A major music publication's readers voted her the 10th best drummer in the world in 1975, placing her above John Bonham of Led Zeppelin. The industry was about to look at all of that and decide none of it was the point. What it was about to do in the name of better stagecraft would set everything that followed directly in motion. The day they moved her to the front. When Herb Alpert heard Karen Carpenter's voice for the first time, he described it as love at first hear. He said it was like magic, and that he had never heard anything quite like it before. He signed Karen and Richard to A&M Records in April of 1969 on the strength of a demo tape recorded in a garage. When their first album failed commercially, and A&M executives told Alpert his experiment was finished, he refused to release them. Close to You spent 4 weeks at number 1 in 1970 and sold approximately 4 million copies. We've Only Just Begun reached number 2. Top of the World hit number 1 in 1973. The Carpenters won 3 Grammy Awards. Between 1971 and 1974, they performed between 145 and 208 concerts every single calendar year. And in the middle of all of that success, the one thing Karen had chosen entirely for herself and built from nothing was taken from her and presented as a professional favor. Concert reviewers had noted that audiences struggled to see the performer on stage. Karen was 5 feet 4 inches tall and seated behind a drum kit that effectively concealed her from most of the crowd. So Richard and manager Sherwin Bash made the call. Karen would move to the front of the stage. A replacement drummer would handle the kit. Multiple people close to Karen confirmed she argued against this decision directly and with genuine force. She told people she was a drummer first and a vocalist second. She fought it, as Richard himself later acknowledged, with everything she had. She lost. The replacement drummer brought in was Cubby O'Brien, a former Disney Mouseketeer who described his assignment plainly in later interviews. The entire purpose of the arrangement, as he stated himself, was to move Karen away from the drums so she could sing more. He was not replacing a hired musician. He was replacing the person for whom those drum parts were not an assignment, but an identity. What it cost Karen was the only territory in her entire life that had ever belonged completely to herself. Behind the drums, her anxiety went quiet. Her body and her mind moved together without friction. There was no crowd to face directly, no appearance to maintain, no standard of perfection to perform under thousands of watching eyes. When she moved to the front of the stage, all of that came rushing in at once, and there was nothing left between her and any of it. The first visible signs of what would eventually consume her appeared in 1973. Karen saw a concert photograph where an unflattering outfit had emphasized her figure in a way she found deeply troubling. She began restricting what she ate. Richard confirmed the timeline specifically, saying that you genuinely have to start addressing Karen's anorexia nervosa by late 1973. The Grammy wins continued. The schedule grew more punishing every year. Karen stood at the front of the stage every night, smiled, sang beautifully, and quietly disappeared. Nobody around her had any framework for what they were watching happen. What the camera caught. There is a BBC interview from October 22, 1981, that remains genuinely difficult to watch. Karen Carpenter sits across from journalist Sue Lawley, visibly gaunt, her face sharp and angular. Lawley asks directly about anorexia nervosa. Karen denies it and says she was just exhausted from years of non-stop touring. Richard interrupts and suggests they move past the subject. Randy Schmidt studied this interview in depth and described the expression on Karen's face in that moment as terror. She did not want to say the truth out loud, so she sat in front of a camera and did not say it. The camera had been catching what Karen refused to say for years by that point. By September of 1975, her weight had fallen to 91 pounds. She collapsed backstage after a show at the Riviera Hotel in Las Vegas, not on stage, as the 1989 television movie would later dramatize, but backstage, falling into the arms of manager Sherwin Bash. Fans attending the shows had already begun approaching Bash privately with their concerns, assuming she had cancer, because in 1975, there was no other publicly available vocabulary for what they were witnessing. The Carpenters canceled more than 50 scheduled concerts, including a Royal Command performance before Queen Elizabeth II. The official statement told the press she had suffered a severe viral infection. The reality was that she could barely remain standing. Richard has now confirmed this directly. He has acknowledged that in the 1970s, the condition was barely recognized, that there was no shared language for it, and almost no effective support systems anywhere in the entertainment industry. He has said they simply did not know what they were dealing with, not because they did not care, but because the tools to understand it did not exist in the places those tools were most needed. John Bettis, who wrote lyrics for the Carpenters, put it plainly. He stated that anorexia nervosa was so unfamiliar to him that he did not know how to pronounce it until 1980. He said, from the outside, the solution looks completely obvious because all a person has to do is eat. So they kept putting food in front of Karen. Karen did not eat it, and nobody understood that the illness had nothing genuinely to do with food. Inside the Carpenter household, the response followed patterns established across decades. Agnes declined any discussion of psychiatric care. Harold enforced this position through silence. The sessions continued. The appearances continued. Karen performed while the people closest to her privately wondered how she was still upright. She was praised publicly for her discipline and her professionalism. Nobody with authority stood up and said the one word that needed to be said. Nobody said, stop. The years that went unspoken. Richard Carpenter's addiction to prescription sedatives began with a legitimate doctor's prescription and escalated across years of relentless touring. By the peak of the addiction, he was taking 6 pills at a time and waking in the night to take more. The last concert Karen and Richard performed together was on December 3, 1978, in Long Beach. In January of 1979, Richard entered treatment at the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, and took the remainder of that year off to recover. For Karen, Richard's rehabilitation removed the last organizing structure her life had contained. The studio work, the touring calendar, the shared creative purpose that had given every year of her adult life its shape, all of it stopped simultaneously. Her illness did not pause in the silence that followed. It accelerated. In 1980, Karen met a real estate developer named Thomas Burris, who told her he had never heard of the Carpenters, which Karen genuinely found refreshing. She became engaged within roughly 2 months of their first meeting. Days before the wedding rehearsal dinner, Burris disclosed he had had a vasectomy before they met. Starting a family was among the things Karen had wanted most from her life. She cried to Agnes and said she wanted to cancel everything. Agnes told her she had made her bed and would now have to lie in it. The wedding went forward on August 31st, of 1980. The marriage was painful from near its beginning, and Karen's closest friends called it the worst possible thing that could have happened to her at the worst possible moment. In January of 1982, Karen moved to New York to work with psychotherapist Stephen Levincron, author of a widely read novel about anorexia nervosa. She began therapy sessions 5 days a week. What Levincron discovered was more severe than anyone had understood. She disclosed that she was taking 90 laxatives every night and 10 thyroid pills daily to accelerate her metabolism, pills that were driving her heart rate to between 120 and 150 beats per minute. Levincron explained later that sustaining a heart at that rate while the body is severely malnourished causes the heart muscle to deteriorate in ways that cannot be reversed simply by eating more. He said Karen almost certainly had no idea what she was doing to herself. Levincron arranged a family session and asked each person present to tell Karen directly that they loved her. Richard had no difficulty doing this. Agnes first corrected Levincron for not addressing her as Mrs. Carpenter, then fell completely silent when the moment arrived to speak the words her daughter needed to hear. She could not say them. Karen had been waiting her entire life to hear those words from her mother in a moment that felt genuine. In that silence, inside a therapist's office in 1982, you can see with complete clarity the distance between what Karen had always needed and what the people closest to her were actually capable of giving. Karen discharged herself from hospital treatment in November of 1982, announced she was cured, and gave Levincron a piece of needlepoint that simply read, "You win, I gain." She filed for divorce from Burris on October 28th of 1982. She was scheduled to sign the final paperwork on the morning of February 4th of 1983. On February 2nd, she called producer Phil Ramone and talked enthusiastically about the solo album they had recorded together in 1979. On February 3rd, she went shopping with her parents and stopped for dinner, ate a full meal, and laughed over the television that evening. She slept that night at the family home in Downey. Agnes heard the wardrobe doors slide open upstairs at 8:45 the following morning. When the bedroom telephone went unanswered, she went upstairs and found Karen motionless on the closet floor with her nightgown resting over her as though she had been in the middle of getting dressed. Paramedics found her heart beating once every 10 seconds. The medical team at Downey Community Hospital worked for 28 minutes. At 9:51 in the morning, Karen Carpenter was pronounced dead at 32 years old.
She had laughed with her family the night before. She never signed the divorce papers. She never heard what Richard would spend the next 4 decades trying to find the courage to say completely out loud.
Tell us in the comments what you believe Richard should have said to Karen that he never got the chance to say, and whether knowing the complete story changes the way you hear her voice when you listen to her music today.